23 wounds carved through flesh and bone, but the true horror of Julius Caesar's assassination lay not in the number of blade strikes, but in the calculated cruelty that preceded them. March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March echoed through history as a day when Rome's greatest leader fell to senatorial daggers. Yet the sanitized version taught in classrooms barely scratches the surface of what actually transpired in the Theater of Pompey that blood-soaked afternoon. The conspirators didn't simply murder Caesar, they orchestrated a ritualistic butchering designed to humiliate, terrorize, and send a message that would reverberate through the corridors of power for generations. Modern historians have uncovered disturbing details that ancient sources either couldn't or wouldn't record fully. The reality involves prolonged torture, psychological warfare, and a level of premeditated cruelty that would make even seasoned executioners recoil. The blood that pooled at the base of Pompey's statue that day carried with it the death throes of the Roman Republic itself. Chapter 1. The trap is set. The conspiracy's dark genesis. The conspiracy against Julius Caesar began not with noble intentions of saving the Republic, but with the petty jealousies and wounded pride of men who had watched their own ambitions crumble before his meteoric rise. What started as whispered complaints in private villas evolved into something far more sinister, carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare designed to isolate Caesar before delivering the killing blow. Marcus Junius Brutus, the man history remembers as Caesar's greatest betrayer, harbored resentments that ran deeper than political philosophy. Despite Caesar's genuine affection for him, some sources suggest Caesar may have been Brutus's biological father. Brutus had watched his own political career stagnate while Caesar accumulated unprecedented power. Ancient sources describe Brutus as increasingly erratic in the months before the assassination, plagued by nightmares and bouts of violent temper that alarmed even his closest associates. The conspiracy's mastermind, however, was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man whose hatred for Caesar bordered on the pathological. Cassius had been humiliated by Caesar's clemency after the civil war, forced to accept pardons that he viewed as condescending gestures from someone he considered an equal. Roman historians recorded Cassius's obsession with Caesar's daily routines, his methodical study of the dictator's habits, vulnerabilities, and trusted companions. This wasn't mere political opposition, it was stalking on an imperial scale. The conspirators began their work months before the assassination, employing tactics that would make modern intelligence agencies proud. They systematically identified and eliminated Caesar's most loyal supporters through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and strategic assignments that removed key allies from Rome. Mark Antony, Caesar's most capable lieutenant, was deliberately engaged in lengthy negotiations outside the city during the crucial period. Other loyalists found themselves facing sudden legal challenges or lucrative postings in distant provinces. More disturbing was the psychological campaign waged against Caesar himself. The conspirators arranged for ominous prophecies to reach Caesar's ears through seemingly independent sources. Soothsayers were bribed to deliver increasingly dire warnings about specific dates and locations. Anonymous messages began appearing in Caesar's residence, growing progressively more threatening and personal. These weren't random acts of intimidation. They were part of a calculated effort to destabilize Caesar's mental state and cloud his judgment. The selection of the assassination site reveals the conspirators' cruel attention to symbolism. The Theater of Pompey wasn't chosen randomly, it was where Caesar's greatest rival had once held court, and where Pompey's statue still dominated the space. The conspirators intended Caesar to die in the shadow of his defeated enemy, a final humiliation that would underscore the temporary nature of all political victories in Rome. Perhaps most chilling was the recruitment process for the assassination itself. The conspirators didn't seek out natural allies or political opponents, they specifically targeted men who owed Caesar personal debts of gratitude. Many of the 60 conspirators had been pardoned by Caesar after opposing him in various conflicts. Others had received political appointments, financial assistance, or personal favors from the man they planned to murder. This wasn't coincidental. The conspirators understood that Caesar's greatest weakness was his belief in human gratitude and redemption. The psychological profile of the conspirators reveals a disturbing pattern of manipulation and calculated cruelty. Several had military backgrounds and understood how to plan coordinated attacks. Others were skilled orators who could manipulate public opinion after the deed was done. But what unified them was a shared willingness to betray personal trust for political gain, suggesting a level of moral corruption that went far beyond ordinary political ambition. The final weeks before the assassination saw an escalation in the campaign of psychological terror. Caesar began receiving detailed death threats that demonstrated intimate knowledge of his daily routines. His food tasters were mysteriously reassigned or fell ill, forcing Caesar to rely on increasingly limited sources for his meals. His sleep was disrupted by strange noises and unexplained disturbances in his residence. These weren't random occurrences, they were the product of a sustained psychological warfare campaign designed to isolate Caesar from his support network and undermine his ability to think clearly. The conspirators also began spreading rumors about Caesar's mental state, suggesting that the stress of leadership had driven him to paranoia and instability. These whispers served a dual purpose. They explained away Caesar's increasingly cautious behavior while preparing the Roman public to accept his death as perhaps inevitable, even merciful. On the morning of March 15th, as Caesar prepared to attend what he believed was a routine Senate meeting, he was actually walking into the culmination of one of history's most elaborate assassination plots. The conspirators had spent months studying his psychology, manipulating his environment, and isolating him from protection. They had transformed a simple political murder into an elaborate psychological torture that began long before the first dagger was drawn. Chapter 2. The butchering begins. 23 wounds and counting. The moment Caesar entered the Theater of Pompey on that fateful March morning, he walked into what can only be described as a carefully orchestrated slaughterhouse. The conspirators had arranged themselves throughout the chamber with the precision of a military formation, each man assigned a specific role in the coming butchery. What followed was not a quick assassination, but a prolonged ritual murder that combined the calculated efficiency of Roman military tactics with savage brutality that shocked even hardened veterans. The attack began not with daggers, but with a carefully rehearsed performance designed to position Caesar for maximum vulnerability. Julius Caesar approached first, ostensibly to petition for his exiled brother's return. As Caesar predictably refused and attempted to dismiss the request, Caesar grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down over his shoulders, simultaneously exposing his neck and restricting his arm movements. This wasn't improvised desperation, it was a wrestling technique designed to immobilize the victim while signaling the other conspirators to begin their coordinated assault. The first blade came from behind, driven by Publius Servilius Casca into the area between Caesar's neck and shoulder. But instead of striking a vital organ, the wound was deliberately shallow, designed to disable rather than kill immediately. Caesar's famous cry, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" was cut short not by death, but by the realization that he was surrounded by men he had trusted, each brandishing weapons and moving with practiced coordination. What followed can only be described as systematic torture, disguised as political assassination. The conspirators had clearly planned not just to kill Caesar, but to ensure he experienced maximum physical and psychological suffering before death. Each subsequent wound was carefully placed to cause excruciating pain while avoiding immediate fatal damage. Modern forensic analysis of the attack pattern suggests the conspirators possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy, likely gained from military experience or gladiatorial training. Caesar's attempts to defend himself were methodically countered by conspirators who had obviously rehearsed responses to his likely reactions. When he tried to break free using his writing stylus as a weapon, multiple hands seized his arms while others continued stabbing. When he attempted to call for help, voices shouted over his cries while more daggers found their marks. The coordination suggests not just planning, but actual practice sessions where the conspirators had rehearsed their roles in this human butchery. The medical reality of Caesar's wounds reveals the calculated cruelty of his attackers. Of the 23 wounds ultimately inflicted, ancient physicians determined that only one would have been immediately fatal, the final blow to his chest that pierced his heart. The other 22 were deliberately designed to cause maximum agony while keeping Caesar conscious and aware of his circumstances. Wounds to his arms and legs severed tendons, preventing effective resistance. Shallow cuts to his torso caused immense pain without striking vital organs. This was systematic torture, not efficient execution. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychological dimension of the attack. As Caesar realized the extent of the conspiracy, he would have recognized face after face of men he had trusted, promoted, or pardoned. Brutus, whom he may have loved as a son, delivered his wound while looking directly into Caesar's eyes. Decimus Brutus, who had been trusted with Caesar's personal correspondence, struck while reciting Caesar's own words back to him mockingly. Each blow came not just with physical pain, but with the agony of betrayal multiplied dozens of times over. The attack's duration, estimated by ancient sources at several minutes, meant Caesar remained conscious and aware throughout most of the ordeal. Witnesses described him attempting to speak, to reason with his attackers, even to bargain for his life as the daggers continued to find their mark. The conspirators showed no mercy, no hesitation, no recognition of his pleas. They had transformed themselves into a pack of predators savaging wounded prey. The setting added to the horror. The Theater of Pompey's marble floors became slick with blood, causing both Caesar and his attackers to slip as the assault continued. The statue of Pompey, Caesar's former rival, seemed to watch over the carnage with stone eyes, fulfilling the conspirators' desire for symbolic revenge. Caesar's blood spattered across the theatre seats, where Roman citizens would normally sit to enjoy entertainment, transforming a space of culture into a scene of unspeakable violence. As Caesar's strength finally failed, he collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, his life ebbing away through 23 separate wounds. But even then, the conspirators weren't finished. They continued stabbing the dying man, some striking wounds that served no purpose except to satisfy their bloodlust. Others carved additional cuts into his already mutilated body, as if competing to claim credit for the kill. The final moments were perhaps the most cruel. As Caesar lay dying, the conspirators forced him to look up at Pompey's statue while they recited a litany of his supposed crimes against the Republic. They wanted his last earthly vision to be of his former enemy's face, his last sounds to be their accusations and mockery. Chapter 3. The Aftermath of Horror. Rome streets run red. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination revealed the true scope of the conspirators' miscalculation and the depth of Rome's descent into chaos. What they had intended as a surgical removal of a tyrant instead unleashed a tide of violence that would consume Rome for years and ultimately destroy the very republic they claimed to defend. The blood pooling around Caesar's mutilated corpse in the Theater of Pompey was merely the first drops in what would become a flood of carnage. The conspirators' first shock came from the reaction of Caesar's body slaves, who had been forced to witness their master's torture and murder. Rather than fleeing in terror as expected, several threw themselves on Caesar's corpse, keening and wailing with such genuine grief that even hardened senators were visibly shaken. One slave, later identified as Antyllus, attempted to gather Caesar's scattered blood in his hands, screaming that he would curse every conspirator's bloodline. This raw display of loyalty stood in stark contrast to the calculated betrayal they had just witnessed, highlighting the conspirators' fundamental misunderstanding of Caesar's relationship with ordinary Romans. Within hours, word of the assassination spread through Rome's streets, but not in the way the conspirators had planned. Instead of relief at a tyrant's death, the city erupted in genuine mourning and rage. Caesar's veterans, many of whom had settled in Rome after years of campaigning, began gathering in armed groups. These were men who had followed Caesar through Gaul, across the Rubicon, and through the civil wars. They had seen him share their hardships, divide plunder equally, and remember their names years after brief encounters. To them, this wasn't political liberation, it was the murder of a beloved commander by cowardly aristocrats who had never risked their lives for Rome. The discovery of Caesar's will 3 days after his death provided devastating evidence of the conspirators' moral bankruptcy. Far from the tyrant they had portrayed, Caesar's testament revealed a man who had planned to leave his private gardens to the Roman people as public parks and 300 sestati to every Roman citizen, an enormous sum that would have required liquidating much of his personal wealth. The contrast between Caesar's final generosity and his murderer's self-serving motivations could not have been starker. More disturbing details emerged as witnesses began speaking freely about what they had seen. Theatre workers described finding not just Caesar's blood, but pieces of his flesh scattered across the marble floor where the frenzied stabbing had torn through muscle and organ. The conspirators had been so consumed with their violence that they had continued attacking Caesar's body even after death, mutilating the corpse in ways that shocked even Romans accustomed to gladiatorial brutality. The examination of Caesar's body by Roman physicians revealed the calculated nature of his suffering. The wounds formed a pattern suggesting the conspirators had specifically targeted areas that would cause maximum pain while prolonging consciousness. Several cuts had been made to tendons in his arms and legs, effectively disabling his ability to fight back or escape while keeping him awake for the psychological torture of recognizing each betrayer's face. Marcus Antony's discovery of the crime scene 3 hours after the murder provided some of the most chilling details that survived in historical records. Antony found Caesar's blood had been absorbed by his toga to such an extent that the fabric had turned completely crimson. More horrifying were the clear signs of Caesar's desperate attempts to crawl away from his attacker's bloody handprints on the marble floor, showing where he had tried to pull himself toward the theater's exits, even as the daggers continued to fall. The conspirators' attempt to present Caesar's head to the Roman people as proof of liberation backfired spectacularly. Instead of celebration, crowds began forming to protect Caesar's body from further desecration. Women threw flowers and jewelry at the funeral bier, while men offered to stand guard through the night. The spontaneous outpouring of grief demonstrated that Caesar's popularity among ordinary Romans was genuine, not manufactured through propaganda as the conspirators had convinced themselves. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of letters in several conspirators' homes detailing their plans not just for Caesar's death, but for the systematic elimination of his supporters. Lists of names had been prepared, prescription orders drafted, and execution squads organized. The assassination was intended to be merely the opening act in a broader campaign of political murder that would have rivaled the worst excesses of Sulla's dictatorship decades earlier. The physical evidence of the conspiracy's extent horrified even Romans accustomed to political violence. Weapons caches were found in several senators' villas, along with detailed maps of Caesar's daily routes and schedules of his appointments. Some conspirators had kept journals documenting their surveillance of Caesar's movements, reading like the notes of professional assassins rather than concerned senators. The most disturbing revelation came from Caesar's personal physician, who examined the body before cremation. Of the 23 wounds, several showed signs of having been inflicted after Caesar had already fallen unconscious from blood loss. The conspirators had continued stabbing his helpless body, driven by bloodlust that went far beyond political necessity. Some wounds appeared to have been made by multiple attackers striking the same location repeatedly, suggesting a feeding frenzy mentality had overtaken the supposedly noble senators. Chapter 4. The Republic's Death Throes. How murder destroyed everything they meant to save. The assassination of Julius Caesar achieved the exact opposite of everything the conspirators had intended, unleashing a cascade of violence and political chaos that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic they claimed to be defending. Within months of Caesar's death, Rome descended into a civil war so brutal and comprehensive that it made Caesar's previous conflicts seem like mere diplomatic disagreements. The conspirators had not saved the Republic, they had murdered it along with Caesar, ensuring that the very institution they sought to preserve would die in the bloodbath that followed. The immediate political vacuum created by Caesar's death exposed the fundamental weakness of the conspirators' planning. They had devoted months to perfecting the murder itself, but given virtually no thought to what would happen afterward. Marcus Brutus, addressing the Roman people from the Capitoline Hill while still wearing Caesar's blood on his toga, delivered what witnesses described as a rambling, incoherent speech that convinced no one of the righteousness of their cause. Instead of appearing as liberators, the conspirators looked like what they were: a group of aristocrats who had committed murder to protect their own privileges. The political chaos that followed revealed the true extent of Rome's institutional decay. The Senate, supposedly the guardian of republican values, proved incapable of governing without Caesar's decisive leadership. Critical decisions were postponed, essential appointments left unfilled, and urgent military matters ignored as senators spent their time in endless debates about procedure and precedent. The very inefficiency that had driven Caesar to assume dictatorial powers now paralyzed the government completely, leaving Rome vulnerable to both internal disorder and external threats. Marcus Antony's emergence as Caesar's political heir demonstrated the conspirators' catastrophic miscalculation about power dynamics in Rome. Rather than restoring collective senatorial authority, Caesar's assassination had merely transferred his power to his lieutenant, who proved far less clement and considerably more vindictive than his predecessor. Antony's first acts included seizing Caesar's papers and treasury, using both to reward his supporters and punish his enemies with a ruthlessness that made Caesar's clemency seem almost naive. The reading of Caesar's will to the Roman people provided a masterclass in political theater that the conspirators were powerless to prevent. When Antony revealed that Caesar had left his private gardens to serve as public parks and substantial cash bequests to every Roman citizen, the crowd's reaction was explosive. The same people who had remained neutral during the assassination now demanded vengeance against Caesar's murderers. The conspirators had inadvertently created their own nemesis by murdering a man whose final acts demonstrated his genuine care for ordinary Romans. The funeral ceremony became a flashpoint that transformed simmering resentment into open revolt. Antony's funeral oration, delivered over Caesar's blood-stained toga held high for all to see, incited the crowd to levels of fury that terrified even seasoned politicians. The spontaneous burning of the Senate House by Caesar's supporters wasn't random mob violence, it was a deliberate symbolic destruction of the institution that had harbored his murderers. The conspirators watched helplessly as their cherished republican symbols went up in flames, consumed by the rage their actions had unleashed. The formation of the Second Triumvirate between Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus represented the final death knell of republican government. This alliance of Caesar's political heirs formally divided the Roman world among themselves, abandoning any pretense of senatorial authority or republican institutions. The proscription list that followed, naming thousands of Romans for execution and property confiscation, made Caesar's previous clemency look almost benevolent by comparison. The proscriptions revealed the true character of post-assassination Rome. Where Caesar had pardoned his enemies and sought reconciliation, his successors compiled death lists with methodical efficiency. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and one of the few conspirators with genuine philosophical motivations, found his name on these lists not for his role in the assassination, but simply because Antony disliked his speeches. The randomness and scope of the killings demonstrated that Caesar's death had not eliminated tyranny, had merely replaced one relatively merciful autocrat with three utterly ruthless ones. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, where the conspirators met their final defeat, provided a brutal coda to their failed revolution. Brutus and Cassius, the moral leaders of the assassination, died not as martyrs for republican freedom, but as defeated generals whose cause had been thoroughly repudiated by history. Their suicides on the battlefield were less acts of noble defiance than admissions of complete failure. They had not only failed to save the Republic, but had actively participated in its destruction. The ultimate irony of Caesar's assassination lay in its long-term consequences for Roman governance. The conspirators who had murdered Caesar to prevent him from becoming king had instead paved the way for his adopted son Octavian to become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The principate that emerged from the post-assassination chaos proved far more autocratic and enduring than Caesar's relatively informal dictatorship had ever been. Where Caesar had maintained republican forms while exercising unprecedented power, Augustus created entirely new institutions designed to concentrate authority permanently in imperial hands. The transformation of Julius Caesar from controversial dictator to martyred hero in Roman popular memory represented the conspirators' most complete failure. Within a generation, Caesar was being worshipped as a god, while his assassins were remembered as villains and traitors. The very act intended to destroy Caesar's legacy instead immortalized it, ensuring that his name would become synonymous with imperial power for millennia to come.